Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 329. And this time I'm going to talk about this record from 1957 by Chet Baker and Art Pepper, Picture of Heath. Now, this, of course, was originally released that year in 1957 by Pacific Jazz, or World Pacific, I guess, as Playboys. But as you can see from the graphic of the original cover, not only the actual name of the magazine, but the wordmark of the magazine were both basically infringed. It's been reissued many times, of course, sometimes with this cover, sometimes with the original Playboys cover. This particular copy that I have is a Japanese reissue from 1992, about which I have really zero complaints. In Chet Baker and Art Pepper, we have, of course, two of the most troubled souls in jazz, who, however, made some of the most beautiful jazz ever. They collaborated 4 times, but all within a rather compressed space of the summer of 1956 to the summer of 1957. Some of those collaborations certainly worked better than others, and this one, I would say, is the pick of the bunch. In previous reviews, I've given some background to both Art Pepper and Chet Baker, and I don't intend to go over all that ground again. Just as a reminder, Art Pepper had joined Stan Kenton's band after the war, but by the early 1950s he left Kenton to get off the road and stay at home in LA. He first began attracting attention as a leader with a great quartet he had with Joe Mondragon, Hampton Hawes, and Larry Bunker, and it's with that group he makes his first ever recordings as a leader with Discovery. Those recordings were made in 1952, and you can find them as a group on a later Savoy release, Surf Ride. Between 1953 and 1955, you can find him on record working with both Shorty Rogers and Shelly Manne, but you really can't separate Pepper's musical history here from his addiction history. By 1956, he was still considered to be talented, but you couldn't really say that about his reliability. But he did still have some supporters in the music business, particularly Dick Bach, who had first recorded him with Discovery in 1952 and now ran his own label, Pacific Jazz. As for Chet Baker, he of course came to fame with Jerry Mulligan's quartet in 1952. That group hit a speed bump in 1953 when Mulligan was busted and was jailed for 6 months. But that wasn't too much of a setback for Baker, who quickly stepped out of Mulligan's shadow and went on to make, by I think the time of this record, 8 different long players for Pacific. So how did Picture of Heath, or Playboys as it was, come to be? Well, as I mentioned earlier on, there were 4 different sessions involving Baker and Pepper in that 1-year period. That they exist at all is down to Dick Bach, who saw an opportunity and was also acutely aware that given the lifestyle choices of these guys, you kind of had to seize the moment. Pepper, of course, had been using much longer than Baker. He'd been introduced to the drug when he was touring with the Kenton Band after the war. And by the mid-1950s, his run-ins with the law were getting more and more serious. He was jailed for a few months over the winter of 53-54, and then for a much longer stretch starting at the end of 1954. Baker, on the other hand, had basically risen to fame, at least initially, without developing an addiction. Sometime around 1955, give or take, he starts using, and by the time that he got back from an 8-month European tour from October 55 to May 56, he was a regular and serious user. However, this wouldn't really catch up to him until about 1958, around the time the Orrin Keep News signs him to Riverside Records. In the summer of 1956, there were no real reputational issues for Baker. He was still a key guy for Pacific Jazz, who were keen to get him in the studio. And as it happened, in the same month that Baker got back from his European tour, Pepper was released after 18 months in jail. And so Dick Bach's brainwave was to get these two increasingly, or at least incipiently, notorious musicians on the same date as the so-called Playboys of jazz. Of their 4 collaborations in 1956 and 1957, 2 are big band dates, one of which was led by Chet Baker in October 1956. That ends up getting put out as Chet Baker Big Band, one of the few, I will say, big band records that I'm actually fond of. The other one is led by Jack Sheldon in August 1957. That is released, I think, in 1960 or 61 as Jack's Groove, but not recorded for Pacific Jazz. In fairness, if you're talking about these as collaborations, those 2 only barely qualify because Pepper is basically a sideman on both those big band dates. He plays on something like half or less of the total tracks on those 2 records. It's the 2 sextet sessions done for Pacific which are of far more interest. The first of those is made on July 26, 1956, when a sextet co-led by Baker and Pepper is recorded live at the Forum Theater in LA. There are 11 tracks which survive from that particular evening. They were never released at the time as a standalone record. That had to wait until 1989, when Capitol, which at that point owned the rights to Pacific's masters, releases a record called The Root. You can also find that full concert on a 2011 compilation put out by Mosaic, on Evil Silver Disc only, called Complete Recordings Chet Baker and Art Pepper. The other sextet recording, which produced this record, was a studio date which occurred 3 months later on Halloween. This record was made on October 31st, 1956 at Radio Recorder Studios in Hollywood. Dick Bach is a producer. There's no engineer listed, which is unfortunately common on a lot of Pacific jazz records. Often it was Bach himself. Baker's on trumpet, Pepper's on alto sax. Phil Urso was on tenor. He had already been on a couple of Baker records, including the first one that Baker made after he got back from his European tour, Chet Baker and Crew. The other half of the sextet, the rhythm section, is basically the core of Curtis Counce's regular working combo. Counce is on bass. He's a great player, and he's increasingly appreciated for the work he did as a leader. There's 4 or 5 records of his, which are increasingly hard to find on vinyl, I will say. Very sadly, he died a few years later after this record was made of a heart attack at only 37. Carl Perkins is on piano. He, of course, had that unusual playing style, which came from the effects of polio on his left arm, and he'd pass away from an overdose just 18 months after this record was made, at age 29. Finally, on drums is Lawrence Marable, who puts in a seriously boppish performance here, dropping bombs and such like. He was a regular session player in LA during the 1950s, but he does have at least one, great record as a leader. Unlike Pepper and Baker, he was another whose career would suffer heavily in the 1960s due to addiction. The arrangements are done by the great Jimmy Heath, who also wrote all but 2 of the tracks. Ironically, this record often gets criticized that it was overly arranged and less spontaneous, let's just say, and less virile, I guess maybe was the implication, than East Coast jazz, which, as I say, is ironic because Heath's East Coast hard bop credentials are basically second to none. The record starts with the title track, Picture of Heath, on which both Pepper and Baker set the tone. What is a very upbeat and uplifting and lively record. Their solos are great. Urso on tenor plays mostly in the higher registers, which, if I were following Art Pepper on alto, I don't think I would necessarily do. Next is From Miles and Miles, which presumably Heath wrote for Miles Davis, but I don't think Miles had recorded this, if he ever did, by this time. It's a lovely track, and it's an example, I think, of the emotional depth that Pepper began to achieve, particularly towards the end of the 1950s. The closing outside one is CTA, which Heath also wrote for Miles, but Miles had recorded this one. He put it out for Blue Note in 1953. So I really enjoy side 1 of this record, but side 2 goes up another level. It starts with For Minors Only, which has a great melody, this really tight arrangement, and strangely enough, it works with the very similarly titled Minor Years, despite the fact they're written by 2 different players. Minor Years follows. This is the first of the 2 Pepper originals. This is a melody, I think, of which Ellington or Basie would be proud. The head arrangement is the piece of this record which one finds oneself, at least I did, whistling days and days later. The rich harmony from all 3 horns is like butter. I think Pepper's solo here is the best on the record. The only slightly down note is that Urso's tenor is a little bit ordinary. Next is Resonant Emotions, which is the last of the Heath compositions, a little bit more subdued, but the change of mood actually really improves the effect. And it's got these great horn harmonies as well, and they're well elaborated. This is the thing that Ted Gioia doesn't like about this record. He feels basically that the head arrangements go on too long. There's not enough basically free-form soloing. I think it's kind of a matter of taste. I mean, you could level a similar critique against, some of the classic Blue Notes by saying, okay, you get 10 seconds of melody from some forgotten Broadway musical, 5 minutes of blowing, and then 10 seconds of melody, and then there you go, again and again and again. So, I mean, what I like about this actually is that it's not formulaic. It falls in between the sort of the Lenny Niehaus, very sort of formulated sort of octet type West Coast things, and a Blue Note blowing session. The last track is a second Pepper original, and it's called Tynan Time. It's named for the Downbeat's West Coast jazz critic, a guy called John Tynan. This might be seen as sucking up, although I don't know if it's flattery because there's at least one yan 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 in Baker's solo. It's the most up-tempo bop number on the whole record and a great way to close out this disc. The obvious comparison point for this record is the sextet session, which was held 3 months before, which was later released as the record The Root, and I find this far preferable. The arrangements and the playing are tighter, the mood is better, the whole feeling of this record is lighter and more enthusiastic. And luckily, you don't have to take my word for it because there are 2 tracks, Minor Years and Tynan Time, which occur on both records, so you can contrast and compare, make up your own mind. As I mentioned, I also take issue with Gioia's critique around, the supposed over-arrangement of this record. I do agree that Phil Urso is outshined here and probably is unnecessary to this record. And yes, the head arrangements are far lengthier than was typical at the time, but they're played and recorded magnificently, with the consequence that this record really swings and the melodies stick in your head long after you've heard it. It's Baker and Pepper's best collaboration, and on an individual basis, one of the best early bits of Baker and of Pepper. And for me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.